Hello, and welcome to this edition of Perennial Activities, a series hosted by the New School Policy and Design for Outer Space. My name is Nick Travellini. I'm a member of New School Policy and Design for Outer Space. And this is an event, Perennial Activities is an event put on as part of the Venice Architecture Biennale in 2021, specifically in the City X Pavilion, which is a part of the Italian Pavilion. So thank you to the Venice Architecture Biennale for giving us the opportunity to put on these series of events and this talk in particular. And so for today, we are very grateful to have Sitraka Rakotoniaina, and I don't think I pronounced that correctly, I apologize, speaking with us about play and thinking about as humans go into outer space, this what seems to be a perennial activity of play or playing, how that will or possibly will change in the future, how it will develop and grow, and where that he sees that going and how he's contributing to it. And so thank you, Sitraka, again, for speaking with us today. Apologies again for mispronouncing your last name. And with that, I will turn it over to you. The floor is yours.
No, the pronunciation of my name was all right. I don't think I can even pronounce my name the way my mom pronounces it, so you're good. Yeah, so I'm gonna try to share my screen. Wait. Here you go. Yeah, the traditional question. Can you all see my screen? Yes. So, hello. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for kind of join me for this talk as well. I feel, as always, very privileged to be able to be here and sharing some thoughts and bits of projects with everyone today. And I'm really hoping that some of it will be of interest. That's my main goal for this. And also, I'm going to try to do something today that I personally haven't done before. So it might be as well like a little bit of a spectacular failure down the line altogether. But I guess, I mean, so long it's spectacular, I guess that's totally fine because there's always some stuff to learn, or at least to some extent. This is what I tell my my students in general. So the reason I'm saying that is because my plan today is to actually end the talk with a kind of 10 to 15 minutes, 10 minutes long networked music performance where I'll be running a server on my laptop. I'll be running a server on my laptop, and I invited my friend Nicholas Mortimer on the call as well to kind of remotely to connect to my laptop, and together we'll be able to jam and manage some level of synchronicity, hopefully. And yeah, because perhaps you've tried to sing happy birthday in unison with your family and friends and it didn't work quite well. In this particular case, supposedly it should be better than that. Although I'd be already happy if we have sound, because who knows what's going to happen. So just to be kind of clearer, this is something that I haven't done before, in the sense that I haven't done it through Zoom and with a kind of virtual audience, but for the past year and a half, we've been organizing with Nicholas and also a couple of other friends these kind of remote jamming sessions. And when Nick Travellini invited me to do this talk on playing in space, I sort of took it very literally and straight away sort of thought of these sessions as good examples of play enabled through systems and software that would perhaps help overcome communication delays over vast distances, but also perhaps overcome extreme isolation by providing some simulated real-time closeness, because jamming and in general collective musical improvisations are for me kind of perhaps a form of play which usually happens through a temporary shared physical and intellectual space, where what matters isn't only the content of the information being kind of like transmitted or shared by and between the participants, like the notes or like the tempo, etc., etc., but it's also what matters is also the kind of the whole atmosphere or the whole vibe that actually shape the actual experience. And that to me could be the kind of challenging thing to retain, at least in the early days of human expansion in space, if we're imagining ourselves spread around kind of like settlements, small settlement and space stations, etc., etc. So simulating or providing this level of kind of togetherness across distances with system like the one we currently use may also favor a certain type of musical experience other than others, based on the way it works to provide what I was talking about, the kind of synchronicity. And in this particular case, I'm talking mostly more from a kind of modular synthesis perspective or modular synthesizer player perspective. Not sure which one is the correct form, because for one, it kind of looks like it looks kind of like the control of a spaceship, and secondly, both Nick and I have been kind of building our own modular system throughout the span of these kind of remote jamming sessions. Not necessarily that we started with these jamming sessions; we started a little bit before, but like kind of these remote sessions were a way of exploring a little bit like what we could do with these kind of modular systems. So to an extent, I would say that the kind of the aesthetic experience of networked musical improvisation has shaped and influenced the ways that I put together my modular system. And then the kind of sound we created influenced the improvisation itself in return too. And for those who aren't necessarily very familiar with modular synthesizers, if modular synthesizer is like a synthesizer, but rather than purchasing the whole synthesizer, you purchase like modules or bits of the function of the synthesizer, and you plug them and route the signal around the way you want. That's a very crap description of what it is, but there we go. Another note on these kind of like temporary and ephemeral kind of virtual spaces we get our heads into is that by their very nature, once the jam is over, every sound we made may be lost forever, and we may not be able to kind of replicate it ever again. But even if it's recorded, what I find very interesting is that what's left from the session isn't only the music, the melody or particular groove or whatever, but rather the feeling of the experience itself, like the way you responded when you heard that thing, or like the way what you did when you hear this, etc., etc. And this kind of like feeling of this experience slowly shapes and builds into your practice, that in turn shapes your sort of personal sonic space. And that sonic space, in my experience, gets defined increasingly by the physical routing of the signals from one module to another with cables and stuff, rather than by the aesthetic of the sound itself that you actually produced, which could be quite a radically different posture from someone who's only making music making music exclusively from within a digital workstation. So that's what we're going to try to do at the end, this kind of like networked improvisation performance. And it's very far-fetched because I don't expect anyone to have their kind of audio interface plugged in and having everything worked out in terms of digital music production right now. But I wanted to, just in case, I wanted to extend this invitation to join my server at the end of these sessions to everyone here. So obviously the spots are limited. So I have got three kind of like, I created 3 user password connection thing for my server because my server is limited by the bandwidth of my internet connection. So yeah, so I'll create this. I'll share the information at the end of this presentation anyway. But just a quick word on the way this works, just in case you want to join or just in case you want to explore that later, like another day, whatever. So I will be hosting on my laptop a Ninjam server, something that's called Ninjam server, which is an open source software that buffers audio from each of the connected parties and play them back to everyone at a specified music interval, so like 16 beats at 105 BPM, for instance, which means that we are not actually playing or hearing each other in real time, but rather the server sort of like increases the delay to provide this kind of latency-free simulation. And that's what I meant earlier by this kind of idea of simulated real time. So we can see that already perhaps this could favor certain types of musicality over others. And then to connect to my server, people can generally use a client software like Jamtower, which is another free software open source program where you'll need to kind of target the IP address of my server and to a certain port number, and also the kind of user password that I mentioned just now. And obviously I provide all that at the end of the session. Of course, I'm not running the server right now. This is also for Nick, who just asked me if I was running the server. I'm not running the server now, so I'll let you know when this is on. Okay, so that was for the music and stuff, and this is actually not my main activity at all. Music, even though I produce music, and I'm also a radio producer on Worldwide FM. I'm also a French designer and artist from Madagascar, and I've been living in and working in London for the past 13 years. And I'm also an associate lecturer in narrative environment at Central St. Martin's University of the Arts London, and also in creative computing at the University for the Creative Arts. And I often refer to my practice as being a designer of things, as my projects are often the result of playful explorations. And whether we are here or in space, play is for me about understanding parameters, understanding limits, and work within these boundaries to imagine new things, new relationships to things, and new ways of being. And I'm gonna quickly actually go through some images, and I'll keep on describing my background just to give you an idea briefly of the things that I do. So my background is actually relatively eclectic. I first trained as an industrial and product designer, and then before completing a master in graphics and multimedia. And I wanted to show you this one because I used like a machine learning model for object detection to score videos in real time. And basically, this one makes music from detecting birds and fish. And that's why it's the name of the actual video. And then in 2008, I moved to London to complete a second master in a program called Design Interactions at the Royal College of Art, where I got familiar with critical design and what later became speculative design. But also it's also where I started looking at design more as a medium and thinking of objects and spaces as narratives. And in general, the practice of design as the creation of meaning and not only as a method for problem solving. And since then, I started approaching my work with a sort of kind of methodological openness, where I like imagining projects beyond particular framework, particular craft, or sense of aesthetic, which leads me to the most recent things I've been working on for the past few years, which started first as a way to imagine futures beyond the often kind of homogeneous popular narrative constructs that end up informing a sort of mental image and feel for a world within which some of us don't even project ourselves into, and therefore may create some spaces for fear and desperation. And often these narratives have these sorts of top-down strategies, like higher authorities with larger goals, driven by unquestioned myths like progress or change. And these strategies filter down to our day-to-day lives and sometimes don't even seem to match the things that I may feel concerned with, and creating perhaps a certain disconnect, and giving me the feeling that I'm perhaps being left behind or something. So I don't know if this sentiment makes sense to you here, but I mean, this is sometimes how I felt. But what I set myself to do is to kind of conversely to these top-down approaches to try to imagine something that would rather emerge from an entanglement of local narratives, starting from the meticulously built environment, the things, the artifacts, and the object we're so good at producing, and the meanings that these kind of like purposely or inadvertently convey, and use these as my main strategy for world building. And this became a rather kind of like playful activity of trying to imagine the things that embody the world within which these things exist. And this is something we often end up referring to as I mean, by we, it's like the people I work with, as reverse archaeology. to caricature the idea of the archaeologist as the person finding bits and pieces like the clues of a puzzle that enables them to extrapolate on worlds and civilizations ritual from kind of distant times. Here I'm interested in the same idea, but applied to kind of future spaces to imagine what we may call, or what we ended up calling with my colleagues, a familiar unknown. And this is not something that is totally new, obviously. So this is, I mean, I usually show this to my students because this is a very intriguing video, which is actually an extract from a documentary about the early days of French television called The Eye of Tomorrow, and it's been directed by J.K. Raymond Millet in 1947. And it's interesting. So basically, it's a very serious documentary about the early days, but there's a part of it that is a kind of like a futurist exercise where they kind of try to imagine what would it look like if TVs were shrunk to pocket size. And this is quite funny because again, this is 1947, but like the sort of scenes that it depicts here is kind of very kind of 2000 or 2021 or kind of contemporary. And the thing that I find really interesting in that is the fact that it is this exercise actually comes almost as kind of comic relief or as a sort of like playful idea within within a rather serious documentary that explains the glory of the early days of French television. And the interesting thing as well is like I heard about this particular, or I saw this particular extract and this particular documentary before there were any Tesla on the road. So it's quite interesting to see that even within the playful idea of trying to imagining things from starting from the small and the peculiar or the practical, like let's shrink a TV screen, they end up kind of like describing things that are very contemporary. And obviously, if you look at your screen, you might end up in a car accident. And so I guess what I'm getting at is that play, or the notion of play and playfulness, is for me an effective strategy for the elaboration of new imaginations and new cultural fiction. And this is what we sort of try to explore with this project, Very, Very Far Away, or VVFA, that we initiated back in 2015 with a friend of mine, Andrew Friend. And it's just a couple of words on this. It's a public-facing research project where our main interest is to partner with groups of individuals and public or private institutions to find creative ways to entertain a diversity of imaginations when attempting to reimagine futures on Earth and beyond. And we use design as an exploratory tool to examine and critique dominant socio-technical imaginaries, explore new relationships between people and technology, and prototype new narratives. And we use a variety of approaches. We sort of like experimenting with wide range of activities, ranging from building a set to kind of like shoot short films, to creating special devices for kind of parents and their kids to record stories in. Obviously, these come with a series of kind of workshop activities to help them elaborate these stories. We also made a multiplayer instrument to try to inform sort of kind of bizarre storytelling rituals. So, I mean, the picture is a bit dark here, but what happens is like you have we build a 9-player synthesizer, kind of 9-player analog synthesizer. And they're all connected to these kind of 3 major big speakers in the center of the room, and everyone is like in circle around. And the idea is like almost like as if you were doing circles around a campfire, is to be able to sing, tell stories, and at the same time play music. And we've also used live action role playing and stage some kind of strange protests. In this particular case, this was with some students in Basel, design students in Basel, where we ended up creating a sort of inventory of objects that haven't been invented yet for potential futures and stuff like that. So in this particular case, they had this idea of creating these banners and curating the protest, basically. And we also similarly set up live radio broadcast where we had the visitors. This is at the Victoria and Albert Museum, where we had the kind of visitors improvising conversations from a series of prompts that we gave them. And also we had, on the other hand, a live noise band called Worms reacting to the dialogue of these conversations in real time. And what's interesting is like, although it might not be obvious from the images that I just showed you, but the kind of projects all the project that I showed you focuses on space exploration and deep time horizons as narrative devices, meaning that the prompts we use with these different groups start by positioning them in some situation in outer space. And interestingly, every single time when we start slightly steering away from focusing only on the technical considerations when it comes to thinking of outer space, we often end up discussing things that may relate more to the meaning of human presence in space, as well as the extension of our human practices and their kind of precedents. And we try to kind of leverage these playful imaginations that emerge from these considerations as a way of depicting not only alternatives and potentials, but also things that may raise some concerns currently, or at least in the near future. So more often than not, traveling very, very far away in spaces and times is never about prediction, but rather enables us to kind of collectively think critically and reflect on the present status quo, on our current attitudes and prejudices. And similarly to the way we create Mars moon simulations to kind of prepare for space on Earth, outer space in our situation has kind of become our kind of playground for thought experiment and for the simulation of different systems or way of doing things on Earth. So another aspect I find quite important as well, and this is why I put this picture up, um, is I think once you've created this narrative, like with this group of people, what do you do with them? This isn't necessarily a question that I have a lot of answers for, but what I've been trying to do is to find ways to archive and disseminate those. This is partly why kind of VVFA is also a podcast that you can find on Spotify, Apple Podcast, I guess, SoundCloud, etc., etc. I've also co-authored, submitted, and presented papers to the International Astronautical Congress, which is probably the biggest yearly space congress where contracts are being signed, big things are being announced and stuff. And I've also taken part in discussion panels. The idea being to try to disseminate some of these ideas in spaces that may be responsible for the continuation and propagation of most dominant and sometimes problematic space narratives. But one slight issue I've had in the recent years is that often I end up in the public engagement part of the Congress, which could be a good thing if I was in the business of like doing public engagement things. But often public engagement is understood as a one-way street. It's often taken for granted that space is interesting and that everyone should care about it. But there isn't necessarily any sort of reciprocity in the sense that not all organizations within that particular space show necessarily any interest in people. And talking about caring for people, I also wanted to talk a little bit about this project I'm involved with, which is called Tour de Moon, and whose creative director is actually a friend of mine, designer Dr. Nelly Benhayoun. And so Tour de Moon is a kind of festival that's been commissioned by Festival UK 2022, which is a festival funded by the UK government to showcase UK creativity. This is also a festival originally labeled as the Festival of Brexit to commemorate the departure of the UK from the EU. And it kind of has tried very hard to rebrand itself in an effort of avoiding being too political, which is an interesting posture to also believe that commissioning something at the convergence of art, science, and culture won't be political, but who knows? So taking part in this festival has been and still is actually quite a little bit controversial, but rather than playing in what the festival may originally stand for with perhaps a kind of nationalistic and closed border feel to it, Nelly and Tour de Moon managed somehow to do the opposite. It kind of platforms openness, diversity, and inclusivity. And I really invite you to actually check out the website, which might make your eyes bleed a little bit, but it's worth checking the Tour de Moon's mission and dedication to plurality, social and racial justice with this kind of impactful and I guess provocative visual language. And one key component that makes this festival actually interesting to me is the planned redistribution of wealth. So Tour de Moon effectively used a big chunk of its funding, and I think it's like 1.5 billion pounds, to organize and create a series of open calls for creative projects with grants and bursaries. So It's kind of open to everyone internationally, aged between 18 and 25 years old, to kind of like submit and propose projects within the scope of Tour de Moon to actually get funding. So really the idea of like taking that money and actually redistributing them was something that is quite key to me. And now the reason I'm talking to you about this is not only to sell you Tour de Moon, but it's also, and or to make you know about this open calls, but it's also because my involvement is regarding the curation and program of one strand of Tour de Moon, which is called Moon Sports, where I propose to actually use sport as a vehicle to reimagine the world and its political and social institutions. The plan is to create a series of activities halfway, so it's still be halfway between a sort of analog mission simulation and a world building exercise where we partner with different kind of youth sports centers and sports club in 3 different cities in the UK to create and invent moon-based sports. Like many of the projects that I'm working on with VFA, the idea is to start from the kind of very practical and specific, and see how these can lead to think in broader terms, broader impact, and maybe conceptually be more abstract, perhaps, etc., etc. So, for instance, we had a workshop like a couple of weeks ago with scientists working at NASA and artists with an interest in space things, to kind of discuss the practical and physical constraints related to being on the moon, like gravity, locomotion, regolith, dust, whatever, and how we could implement some of these in our activities and use these as parameters to help imagine and conceive moon sports, and how these moon sports, restrained by very different parameters and landscape down on Earth, may favor different things like inclusivity and solidarity instead of focusing perhaps on pure competition, etc., etc. So the idea is that sport in this particular situation can be a platform to both like provide access and also help looking at things from a different perspective. So the plan for this is to actually design and build an inflatable playground that is a sort of mixture of lunar stuff, like, I mean, by stuff I mean moon landers, lava tubes, boulders, craters, etc., but also create some more kind of modular, simpler objects to be moved around and also rearranged by the participants to create boundaries or obstacles, etc., etc. The idea is that the playground will act as both a simulation ground, but also as prompts to inspire radical imaginations and invent new worlds. So this is some sort of mock-up of like very early mock-up of the playground, like in amongst like our early drafts. And you can see, I mean, I don't know if you can read actually the dimension, but we kind of went a little bit over the top with the dimension, I think, in there. But basically, Moonsport, we also have like some digital manifestation. So we plan using existing video game platforms, a little bit like Dreams on PlayStation. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that, but basically it's a video game to be able to design, within which you can design other video games. And the idea also is to create a series of events and to create moon sports and video game and kind of stream the confection of these games and sport on Twitch or similar platform to serve as a series of public workshopping sessions. So kind of like inviting people to design along the people who are actually designing this for video games and etc. So, I mean, maybe you can hear it's not necessarily very well put together because we're still pretty much work in progress and the thing's going to evolve lots within the next few months, but this is just a preview of what eventually we're going to be end up doing. And we're also going to have like very specific calls as well, open calls for kind of digital creator to help us produce assets like video game assets and stuff like that, and also for distributing on different platforms these assets in order to make it available to the widest audience. And the reason why we do that is because increasingly, kind of, especially during the kind of lockdown period, video games are becoming these very interesting platforms for remote collaboration. This is, for instance, an image from Hugo Pilates' Fortnite workshop, where they use the video game Fortnite in sandbox mode to build, prototype, and explore alternative lifestyle with participants from around the world collaborating and building the sort of like they try to build their own sort of digital communes. And talking video game and play, this is something that I'm actually currently developing slowly, but hopefully I'll get to make some sort of mini demo sometimes in 2022, basically building upon the kind of sightseer improvised performance that I was mentioning before, like the radio broadcast performance that I mentioned before at the VNA. I build upon that and kind of like start implementing this game where you kind of see the game through the eyes of multiple characters. So despite the stories taking place in the same sort of geographical space, their worldview and perception are sort of juxtaposed and superimposed like different realities with different reference points layered on top of each other. And basically, playing different character leads you to see the world and the environment under kind of literally different lights. And the game takes place on a fictional and artificial island called Geospisa. It's the anchor of the first and only space elevator. And the island consists of different biomes and neighborhoods with their own history in relation to space and relation to the elevator shaft. The characters' interests and preoccupations also change depending, the further away you actually are from the water, so going upwards. And the main plot is that there is a power blackout on the island, and by impersonating and playing as the different characters, you sort of form your own opinion about the causes of this blackout. So, despite having a sort of main plot, the idea is that there is kind of no linear narratives. It's more of a walking simulation to an extent where you glean bits of information as you explore the island, find objects, talk to NPCs, witness things, etc., etc. And in that respect, I think video games, and most notably actually RPGs and open world games, have reached a point now where they feel kind of inhabited, or a player can inhabit these worlds and have their own worldview within the game, which is quite an interesting thing. And I'm sort of interested in exploring this aspect, see how it perhaps changed the way we may tell stories, and how it may as well change the stories we might be interested in telling as well. Yeah, so I feel like I've been rushing through things, but hopefully it's clear to a certain extent. So that's pretty much it. I mean, I hope it was clear a little bit, some aspect, the reason why I'm showing things and the relationship between the things that I presented to you. Obviously, if you want more information, you can go on my website and stuff, but you can also probably better ask me during a Q&A. But obviously, this is not necessarily directly the end of this talk. I thought what would be quite interesting is actually take, I don't know, 5 minutes to actually, I wanted to introduce Nicholas Mortimer, who luckily agreed to take part into this talk. So I don't know if you're here, Nicholas.
I hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you properly. Yeah, so Nicholas really agreed to stay later at Goldsmith University to actually participate in that talk, to do this kind of remote jamming together. But perhaps, I mean, do you mind introducing yourself a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sitraka. Fascinating to hear a bit more about your work. So who am I? I'm Nick Mortimer. I've been working around sort of narratives of technology and the politics of technology for probably about 5 to 10 years. I studied on the same course as Sitraka back in 2013, just a little after he was there. And since then, I've been developing a practice that kind of overlaps between kind of performance, electronics, automatic writing to kind of create narratives and design fictions that really probe at some of the kind of pressing issues surrounding the way we think about technology, use that technology, and who gets the kind of right to design that technology. So I hope that sums things up nice and neatly for you, Sitraka.
No, yeah. I mean, I knew what you were doing, but I would have never been able to actually explain it this clearly. I was wondering if you wouldn't mind, basically, because I explained a little bit what I find interesting in this kind of networked music improvisation, and I was just wondering if actually, what would be your position on that, in the sense that do you think it's a massive loss in comparison to actually doing it physically in the same room and etc., or do you think it's just different? And yeah.
I definitely don't think it's a loss. I think it's just a really fascinating way to sort of confront this issue of telepresence that I guess was part of design discourse, about 15 or so years ago, with the emergence of certain communications technologies. And by telepresence, I simply mean that connection across distance, using technology to kind of feel or communicate or develop relationships at distance. So I think what we've been establishing through our sort of musical sessions was kind of something born out of necessity through the pandemic. It was something that we could use and develop and understand together. I certainly didn't know much about this like remote jamming technology, and I was fascinated by how it could really put us literally synchronized in real time across miles and miles away. We live quite far, don't we? I guess, yeah, I think it's for me, what's so fascinating about it, what I enjoy is that, like in music, quite often you tend to develop a language of improvisation with other players. You have to sense and feel each other and sort of know what kind of directions people are going to go musically, harmonically. And to be able to do that without being in the same room as somebody has been, I guess, with you anyway, has been a kind of great lesson in developing this language, understanding how to scope that out and where that can go. And I think we've kind of approached this, I guess, both of us, in that open-minded way. We've made a few mistakes, but there's been these kind of joyous times where things sort of just meet up and make sense. So yeah.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you very much. I think this is always, I mean, this is something that we discussed before, but it's nice to hear. Like the really interesting thing as well, I mean, I don't know if anybody cares, but is also that Nick and I, because of this kind of remote jamming, we mostly communicate via text messages.
Yeah.
And we actually rarely talk to each other directly. So
yeah.
I read a lot about that, and we discussed a lot about that through kind of like messages and stuff. But it's actually nice to hear you talk about it with your actual voice.
Yeah. I mean, it's great. It's great to see you. It very rarely happens.
Okay, so now I have started my I've started my server, and I'm gonna just copy that in the chat somewhere, if I can access the chat somehow, which I've got no idea how to. Maybe I need to stop sharing this. And
we're definitely on 105 BPM, Sitraka. This is us kind of beaming in our
exactly.
sort of space units to just calibrate our equipment.
Yeah, I think it's 105.
Right,
and cool. I'm not even connected.
This is me, guys. Just so, I mean, this is like I'm in a very small Deptford office. I have the server. I have something here. Oh, the server's not working, Chuck. It says timeout.
I'm connected.
Okay, I'll try again. Okay. There we go.
And this is where everything.
Oh, I'm in. We're good.
Yeah, I can see it. This is where everything collapses.
And this is where I guess I'm going to mute my microphone now, because that would be pretty horrible.
You're disconnected again from the server, Nick.
It's coming on. It says I'm on.
Really?
Yeah. I can see I'm in 92, 23, 212, 168, 2049er.
Yeah, that's correct. Let me. What's my IP? Yeah, that is correct. This is the right IP. Okay. Are you still connected?
Yep. It's saying connected as Nick. I've got nothing from you. I can hear myself through Jamtaba. Do you want me to disconnect and start again?
Yeah, if you don't mind. And then let me know if you're actually beaming some sounds. And
yeah, I am right now, but I'll start again. Okay, here we go. Disconnect. This is riveting watching, clearly, but bear with us.
Yeah, am I going to share my terminal so people can see the riveting actions on my server?
You can start if you're playing, and I'll try and join and keep volume down. Yeah, you do that.
I'll do that, and I'm gonna ask people in general to let me know if they can actually hear something when I start playing something.
Okay, sure thing.
Oh yeah, cool. So there is sound coming out of the thing. I can see connected, Nick.
You can see me?
For some reason, you're connecting and you're leaving the server, so I don't know what's going on anyway.
Yeah, it's timing out, Sitraka. I'm really sorry. I'm not.
Are you using?
I'll try one more time. Yeah, I'm not hearing anything of yours on Jamtaba, so I'm failing that. But hey, yeah, it's the internet. Yeah, it's definitely the internet, Nick. It might be. Let me try something separate here. Shall I try different? I'm using Eddie Rome.
Because there might be some.
Okay, I'm going to switch to my phone. Shit. I'm going to set to my phone. Okay.
Okay. Really riveting.
All we want is some jam. We want 5G in space right now. That's what we want. Okay, here we go. Let's try again.
I can see you.
Am I still there?
Yep. I'm not receiving anything, but I can see you connected.
Yeah, you're in. We're in. Okay, I'm gonna mute.
Here we go. Okay. Feel like we could have. I don't know. I don't know at all if it sounded any the way it actually sounds for us.
It's funny, you know, because I was thinking whilst we were playing as well, it's a lot to do with flow states. You know, this is the kind of a form of play where you kind of go into a bit of a trance. So I can see from an audience perspective, this could also not translate, but it's great fun.
It's always great fun, especially for the people who are actually participating. Okay.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sitraka.
Well, thank you for putting this up. Now, does anyone have a particular question?
Sorry, that's my cue. Thank you, Sitraka, for that amazing, super interesting talk about your work and where you think that play is going and what you're doing to create the future of play. And thank you for that performance, that playful performance. And thank you, Nick, for participating in that as well and for making that happen. That was awesome. I don't know how it sounded to you too, but it sounded great as an audience member. It sounded really cool. I was super, super into it.
Well, I'm glad then. I'm
yeah. So I think now we'll move into the sort of Q&A discussion portion of the event. And so if folks have comments or questions they'd like to raise, get on the table, please do feel free to use Zoom's raise your hand function under the reaction button to raise your hand if you want to verbally address your question or your comment, or if you're not comfortable doing that, please feel free to type it into the chat and I'll relay it verbally. Go ahead, Sans.
Hey guys, that was great. Really, I know that it can be uncertain when you can't actually see or be in the same room as the audience, so I'm sure that's a bit of a weird experience. But from this end, it was very cool and really fascinating to think about the distance aspect of this while watching. Even the troubleshooting at the beginning felt like it felt like almost like a fictional performance of trying to do this interplanetarily or what have you. So I guess the question is, I'd be curious to hear any more about the process that you've been going through, similar to what we've seen here, just but experimentally and not in a live performance. And if you've thought at all about simulating greater distances. So I know that in some of the underwater research, there have been simulations of greater distances, so they'll delay communications, they'll artificially degrade the quality of comms in order to start to get a sense of what it will be like working with really remote teams on ocean worlds, for instance, is the context that I've seen this in. But yeah, I'm curious to see it, to hear if you've thought about trying to artificially increase the distance in between these performers.
Not necessarily in terms of like not from a technical perspective or like but conceptually more thinking about the distances between what you hear and what you think you've heard. This is something that it's quite recent things, like things that I've been working on, again, like on the side. I mean, just I think I mentioned that during my talk, but like the way I work is very kind of exploratory. So things take kind of a while to actually manifest themselves into something. But basically a few months ago, or like maybe almost a year ago, I started looking into, I started getting interested in ways of doing this kind of remote synchronization. But like suddenly I thought, how about doing this kind of like creating these sonic fictions, but using kind of like a Foley studio type of setup where things that you hear may kind of remind you of a soundscape, but actually the thing that you hear is like, I don't know, me, I don't know, crushing some potatoes or whatever, or simulating kind of sounds and how similarly, I mean, it's maybe not directly related to your question, but like related to, I don't know, things such as the way we use sonification to hear distance, kind of like planets wavelength or like colors wavelength, and etc., and the kind of sound of space and that kind of thing. And I found it quite interesting, this idea between like sonification and the idea of like hearing things that isn't there technically. A kind of something that kind of interests me, and I'm wondering how we can actually take these ideas and create sonic experiences that aren't necessarily something that you would think of or that we naturally experience, I guess. I mean, it's all very new, so I may not be very clear when I when I explain that, but I mean, to me, new to me. But basically, what I found really interesting and what I found quite crazy during the kind of lockdown period and stuff is my relationship to, I mean, I've always done music and stuff, but my relationship to sound and isolation, and I guess to a certain extent the fact that you never kind of really play in real time with other people, kind of make you focus more on your experience of creating your own sonic space rather than the musicality, or like the kind of, I mean, I guess it also depends on the instrument that you're using, but yes, I don't know, it's a little bit of a convoluted answers, but not directly in kind of practical term extending distances, but rather conceptually. That's what I've been looking into without any particular outcome or results to bring to you.
Yeah, it's fascinating that, I mean, over very long distances, it seems like there would be some amount of kind of a hybrid situation where you both are isolated and you are playing in, your immediate surroundings, even with this connection over great distances. So it's, yeah, no, that's fascinating to think about the fact that it's almost a co-isolation in a way.
Yeah, but exactly, like but it's really bizarre because it creates a little bit what Nick was saying in terms of like you get into some sort of trance, but really when we do like 1 hour sessions, and we usually do that in the evening, and we maybe knackered and stuff, and then we do that, and actually you get into it, and it's kind of difficult to get away from it, and because it create, like, although we're not together in the same room, it create a different kind of togetherness, which I thought which I never experienced before, but and I thought that was quite an interesting thing.
So I'll go ahead and put myself on stack. And one thing that this really got me thinking about is the role that space has historically played in thinking about time and temporality and spatiality. And so for folks who may be interested in some of this, I'm going to go ahead and drop a link into the chat to a book called Einstein's Clocks, Poincaré's Maps. And in this book, the author, Peter Gallison, talks about the way that in the latter half of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, technologies were used to try to figure out what time it was at particular locations, and then figure out how far away from each other they were based on what time it was at each location. And they used like observatories and the positions of like the stars and stuff like that to figure it out. And it actually developed into or reshaped our concept of simultaneity and of how time and what time is and how time operates. And eventually, the author takes it to Einstein developing the theory of relativity. But one of the things that the author, Peter Gallison, really emphasizes in this book is the role of the technical infrastructure that's necessary for this. So think of like in the like at the time of the American Civil War and later, they were trying to lay like undersea cables so they could do like telegram transmissions across the Atlantic Ocean, for example. And so, Sitraka, I want to get your thoughts about the role. So you started talking about building out, say, the playground, or the or what we saw, the troubleshooting live of the technical infrastructure of like the internet connection and trying to switch to a different means of connection. And what do you think, as we're thinking about playing together, both in person and in these sort of remote ways, how are you thinking about designing the infrastructure for that in terms of can you just elaborate a little bit more on your thought processes of how you are doing that and what goes into actually conceptualizing and building out that infrastructure that you're working on or that you talked about? Maybe you can elaborate on one particular thing that you talked about in your talk, to help give it like ground us in this conversation instead of making it a very, very abstract question.
I'm not sure if when you're talking about the infrastructure, it's like the actual thing that I'm using in order to get synchronicity between Nick and I. Is that what you mean?
Well, you describe yourself as a designer of things, and so can you talk through your design process, and I guess in a little more detail, in order to construct the things which are then used as sort of infrastructure for playing?
Yeah, totally. I mean, well, my kind of thought process is very. I mean, the reason why I ended up like talking about being it started as obviously like everything started as a joke, because it was very difficult for kind of people to pin down exactly what I do from a design perspective, because depending on what circles you're hanging out, when you say designers, sometimes people think automatically graphic designers, sometimes product designers, etc., etc. And since my background is a bit hybrid and my interests are a bit like quite eclectic in terms of like medium, I ended up telling people that I was like just designing things in general because I quite like objects, or I quite like tangible manifestations of things. But in general, this is kind of like, this is what shaped a little bit my design process, in the sense that I tend to first look at the context within which actually I'm doing, or I'm planning on doing design interventions. And the first thing is a little bit similar to what you described, is looking at the infrastructure, or not necessarily if I don't build it myself, is actually being able to understand it to an extent that I feel familiar with it, and I can start planning and imagining things beyond the limitation of this thing. So I like coming into a particular situation and actually like just a simple thing. For instance, like let's take the thing that I showed at the very beginning, which is this kind of birds and fish video where I use basically an object detection model to actually detect birds and fish in a David Attenborough video, and I create in real time the score for the video. It really started really randomly when I was just playing around with object detection, and also the ability to be able to train the model on images for me, and etc. So it isn't something, I mean, object detection is quite something easy to handle now. But when I started doing that, it was quite interesting because it was my entry point to machine learning. and I needed to understand like how things connect to a certain way or how things talk to each other in order for me to start playing around and literally turn these kind of like limitation into some sort of playground where I can try to elaborate things and new things in the sense of new to me things. And it's just by testing and really I have this kind of process of really going very practical very quickly. So basically I like thinking through making, and this is something that I often tell my students, because I think this is another way of looking, like, because you can do desk research, you can do kind of like master planning, but as soon as you start prototyping things, I mean, at least in the design realm, you start looking at the thing that you were conceptualizing in a complete different light. And so it is very important for me from a practical standpoint to understand the boundaries of the tools and the medium that I'm using in order to start having fun with them. And that's pretty much what my kind of design process always been. And in this particular case as well, with the sort of like syncing different, like syncing to my server and etc. I mean, I didn't write any of this program, or I wouldn't even know where to start to actually write these programs. But I spent quite a lot of time actually playing with this idea of basically being able to do like full gig, completely remote, and do live audience and this kind of thing. And actually, in the kind of design process, it leads you always to a space that you didn't necessarily foresee. And I think this is the thing that excites me the most, in the sense that I really hate doing things multiple. I hate doing the same thing over and over again. And I'm kind of like, I like the idea of creating experiments that leads to accidents, and these accidents being the discovery of something that I found suddenly fascinating. So it's just like, my whole design process is probably related to putting together the right configurations to create accident within the context I'm actually intervening. And sometimes it's good, sometimes it's rubbish. But another part of it, and this is something often that I don't hear people talk about, is the fact that I'm not scared of completely failing when I do these things, which is another part, like, because when you're being experimental, if you're truly being experimental, you fail a lot of time. And I think this kind of debugging phase and trying to make it work and etc. I mean, this is part of the thing as well. Obviously, the way you present things often is try to present things as slick as possible, but in my design process, there's a lot of mistakes, and actually these mistakes kind of like lead to something that is much more interesting and genuine in general.
Fantastic, thank you. Is there anybody else who'd like to get any questions on the table? Feel free to raise your hand or type into the chat. I'll also note that I want to plug, I posted this in the chat already, a collection of short stories by a woman named Rashida Phillips, who's part of the Black Quantum Futurisms Collective. And the book is called Recurrence Plot and Other Time Travel Tales, that I think, Sitraka, you would find very interesting, the work and the sort of alignment. There's quite a bit of resonance with what you're doing. So I think you personally would find this very interesting, but I also want to recommend her work to other folks. I read an excerpt of it in a collection put out by a group that she's also been a part of, called Metropolarity. And it was really fascinating. And so I want to plug the whole book to folks as well. But anybody else have anything that they want to get on the table here? Sitraka, I do have another question if folks don't have anything. But also, I want to make sure to leave time for if you have any final thoughts or parting questions or comments that you want to leave us with. So let's see if anybody else has anything. And if not, why don't we go to that? And then I can just follow up with you with my questions offline.
I think you can go ahead with your question.
Okay, then I guess, so you said that you wanted to, or you like to create the conditions for accidents to happen. And I think I've mentioned this to you in prior conversations. Some of my personal work is thinking about industrial safety and industrial
Mhm.
accidents, and how people work to try to understand how accidents happen, but also how to, you know, prevent them and not let people get hurt. And so, how do you're not necessarily doing stuff that's going to get people hurt, but like you also want to balance the sort of safety aspects, like when you're building that playground, for example, or when you're working with the kids who to like help them elaborate these narratives and to elaborate them doing these workshops. Like the hope is to produce something good and positive, but also, you know, you're affecting them and potentially giving them powers and abilities that they could put to evil.
I don't, I don't know if I have that
How do
kind of
you think?
power.
Yeah. How do you think about creating the conditions for good accidents or positive
I,
growths?
I didn't necessarily, I never kind of actually thought about any of that in a kind of like positive and negative. Maybe I should do that. But I mean, it's interesting because when you were talking about the aspect of safety, when I was doing my projects in grad school, it was often there was very no limit to no safety at all. So, I mean, I didn't explain. I didn't explain the projects because otherwise it would have taken forever. But some of the things that I showed at the very beginning, that I kind of like massive catapult for shooting lump of steel to nanoceramics and stuff like that. So, and and one of the projects that I've done as well is a kind of like giant Russian roulette with chalk bullets in order to see if people can predict the future by recording their physiological data and see if they can predict or sense when the chalk bullet is going to be fired at them, and that kind of thing. So there's other, yeah, at the very beginning, I mean, at least like a few years back, the type of physical project that I would do, they were quite violent to a certain extent, and they were also violent in the sense of, I mean, violent, I guess it's relatively violent, but there was like this idea that it isn't, I mean, the thing is that I don't think it's like it's not trying, I mean, in these particular situations it was not trying to kind of prank people, so people knew what they were walking into and etc, and kind of agree with the kind of like the scope of what may happen to them, and agree as well that some aspects of it are completely out of my control in some ways, but still agree to it. Obviously I'm not put people in situations where they can die because that would be pretty stupid, but these kind of like I don't know if, I mean, I'm not doing this kind of project not necessarily because I don't want to, but more because I kind of moved away from these kind of very kind of physical uh things. But these sort of like accident that I create now, they're more, again, it's more abstract accidents, like way of like sort of crossing references in ways that you wouldn't necessarily think about. So when we organize workshops, especially within the scope of VVFA, it's like the amount of different strategies that we put in place in order to create situation where people would suddenly feel comfortable talking, or like, for instance, the way originally when we started VVFA wasn't necessarily was connected to the idea of future, but not necessarily connected to space exploration. And we realized that very quickly there was no, in that particular case, no accident happening. People were like, it was a public facing series of workshops that we did very early on, and people would come to these workshops with very specific idea about technology and future. And depending on if they were kind of more left-wing or more conservative, they would have like confrontation within the workshop about the future, and it would feel very kind of close to home. And they wouldn't necessarily, it's not that I don't like confrontation, it's just that these confrontation wouldn't be necessarily very productive, where people actually don't listen to the arguments of one side or the other. So it was basically no dialogue. And then we started using actually space exploration as a strategy to enable them to think about beyond their kind of like surrounding area. And they started talking about the same topics but suddenly being more keen in listening to each other's arguments simply because they were not at home anymore, but they were somewhere in space. And so they kind of allow themselves to start prototyping, and suddenly this is where they start looking and thinking about things differently. And I do believe that the happy accident in this particular case is like when people go away, these are conversations that would stay with them, not necessarily the actual topic itself, but the way they eventually opened some aspects or some part of their mind to other kind of perspectives, accidentally in that particular case, is a kind of positive thing. And we've seen that multiple times throughout the different workshops that we did, and also not necessarily, it doesn't manifest as clearly as that all the time, but like this is why we create these kind of devices or create these like, for instance, at the moment we're planning a series of napping sessions, sleeping sessions, 2 hours nap, where we basically put people together as a kind of ritual. So our stuff kind of moved from like these kind of really kind of violent devices, like slash scientific experiment, to more kind of ritualistic slash mystic stuff, which I think is connected in some ways anyway, because the aesthetic of belief is in both realm, like in the scientific one as much as the other one that may be less scientific to a certain extent. But basically, so we're doing these particular, we're planning on doing this particular thing, which is a 2 hours nap, and we kind of like create the circumstances for people to actually feel not necessarily comfortable enough to actually have deep sleep, but like comfortable enough to fall asleep. So it comes with a series of instruction of things to eat and things to this is all being planned, so it's not completely conclusive yet, but it'll need some tests, etc. But the idea is to put people in situations where they sleep not comfortably enough to deep sleep, but to be in kind of rapid eye movement and eventually start dreaming, and see how we can influence these kind of like dreamy state with sound and other stuff in order to create bizarre narrative or stories in their head, and see if that could help leading to some situation where narratives or stories or little fictions or little dreams are kind of like beneficial for other aspects, not necessarily beneficial in terms of like I don't know, mental health or stuff like that, but beneficial in terms of like creating new conversations around a particular topic that we try to insidiously implement within their dreams or something like that. I don't know if it makes any sense what I'm just saying, but
no, that sounded great. That sounds. If I were in London, I would sign up for to participate in that. I would be a guinea pig for getting that set up. Yeah. So if you think of a way for me to do it from America, let me know.
Yeah, maybe we can do an online sleeping nap. Yeah, we need a good title first, and then.
Okay, maybe that'll be how I contribute. I'll come up with something. I'll brainstorm something. Okay, so I think it's about time that we wrap. We're hitting the hour-and-a-half mark. So are there any final thoughts, any final questions that you want to leave us with when thinking about play and playing and space in the future?
I don't feel like I have necessarily a final big statement to leave you with. I just think that playful approach to imagining things is always a positive thing, I think, because I don't know, in my situation, it's like when you take things, when you're too precious about the way you think and the thing that you think often it's not a good style. No, just from personal experience in general, and I think the thing is, like, I'm very happy to have done this talk, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to talk about these things, which I'm interested in, and having people to actually listen to what I'm saying is it's great. So that's what I'm gonna leave you with. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you for speaking with us, and thank you for participating in this series, Perennial Activities. Thank you, Nick Mortimer, the other Nick, on the call, on the line. Thank you to everyone who came out today for attending this edition of Perennial Activities, part of the City X Pavilion and the Venice Architecture Biennale 2021. We have one more event tomorrow at the same time that will be actually from Sans, who's on the line with us and spoke earlier, on crafting. So please make sure to come out, attend that if you're able, or make the time to come out. If you can't do it at this point, make the time to come out. It's going to be a great talk. And thank you so much, everyone, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you very much.